Hey guys, good to talk to you about the NES controller and them not working. A lot of videos out there about just cleaning the inside of these controllers, but really not anything about why sometimes they don't work. So, to give you an example here, I'm going to go ahead and start up this game. Make sure it's not too loud. Nope, it's not too bad. This is the controller here that I've already done the fix to. And what the problem is actually the IC chip, integrated controller chip. And as you can see, this controller works just fine. But then if we were to go to this controller that I'm going to be using as an example, this is one that is still broke. It needs to be fixed. I'm going to go ahead and plug that in. And as you can see, I got nothing. No controls whatsoever. So, what I'm going to go ahead and do is line us up for another shot so we could actually start looking at the integrated controller chip that is going to get replaced inside the controller itself. So we'll be right back up while I set up the new shot. Okay, now that we're lined up where you could actually see what I'm doing, this here is the controller that we just saw earlier that wasn't working. So we're going to go ahead and unplug it from the console first and flip it over, and we're going to want to remove the 6 screws that we see here on the back. I'll go ahead and speed this part up in post. Okay. And now with the back open, what we see here, of course, is just the circuit board itself in here. Not too complicated on this side, but actually what we're going to want to replace is this guy right here. This is the IC chip. This is actually one I took out of the other controller that I had just fixed earlier. And what I did is I actually ordered online from a website. It's called console5.com. I'll put a link in the description. But these chips are extremely inexpensive. I think they were only about 43 cents a piece. So I went ahead and just ordered 5 of them, even though I only had 2 controllers to fix, just in case I made some mistakes. Then I had some extra ones. But as you can see, we got the direct replacement. The new ones that are actually coming in, I don't know if we can see it in the light or not, but they're actually manufactured by Texas Instruments. Not like that actually matters as far as the brand name. However, the chip number for this one that I'm replacing with is CD4021BE. So, let me get this part out here. I'm going to unwrap the cord here. Set that aside. So what you're going to want to actually do is desolder this here, all these pins that the chip go through to the board. Get that desoldered, soldered in the new chip, and you should be good to go. Now, even with my soldering skills, I'm very much so a novice and was able to even tackle something like this with relative ease. However, you do want to try to be careful as much as you can. If I could even get into certain light here. Okay, sorry about that. Wanted to reline up and zoom in a little bit more on this board to show you what we're going to be talking about next. So again, left off on talking about how we're actually going to want to desolder each of these pins from the board itself. And then when we resolder, what we're going to want to do is double check with our multimeter to make sure that with each of these individual pins, let me get it back into the shot here. Sorry guys, I'm zoomed in so close I'm all over the place. But whenever you want to, or whenever we resolder in the new chip, each pin that goes through the board, it's really hard to see because I don't have a macro lens to really zoom in right now, and my lighting in here is a little poor. But each individual pin has a little dot or a little blob of solder to connect it to the board. But what we want to try to do, can't talk today. What we want to try to do is make sure that each of these solder points do not connect with its neighbor. We do not want to have any continuity. They need to be separated individually. Again, it's really hard to pick up in this shot. I would almost need to get like a macro lens to really zoom in on it. But again, it's just such a tiny amount in between each one of these pins. But again, the solder points do not actually connect with each other. If they do, you would probably have more controller errors or incorrect button pushes if those solder points were connected. So with a multimeter, what you'd want to do is just set it to a continuity setting, and then you would actually take each pin, and again, this is after you get done soldering the new end. You would actually want to touch each of these legs, one right next to the other, and make sure that you don't have that continuity. So you would just go ahead and touch two pins, two separate pins, two neighboring pins, with the red and the black here, to make sure that each of those pins, again, the neighboring pins, don't have any continuity. And you would just keep moving down the line, making sure that the neighboring pins don't actually have any connection between your two soldering points. So that being said, let's go ahead and I'm going to get this one desoldered. And then one of the things I got is actually this little soldering iron online from Amazon, real cheap. I don't even know what this brand name is, and Best or whatever. Oop, let me get it in a shot again. It was only $20. In fact, I'll just zoom out a little bit more now that we're doing this portion. Get refocused in here. And with this soldering iron here, it was only $20 on Amazon. This is all you would need for a job like this. It did come with a solder sucker, which of course you just load it up. It's just on a little simple spring. And then when you heat up the solder, you put the little end on there, and it sucks the solder out. It works okay. It's not great. It's a little lengthy, and it took me quite a few tries, even on the same single soldering point, to even get the solder up out of there. I'd probably recommend one of those soldering braids, where just, again, it looks like a braided piece of copper that you would actually heat up and push onto the solder, and it actually draws the solder up onto the braids. I would probably recommend that over even this. But I'm going to go ahead and desolder to these points and get the chip out, and then we'll be right back. Okay, and really quick, I wanted to show you here as well. I went ahead and went through and heated up the soldering points and used my solder sucker and got the majority of the solder off of the legs here on the board itself. But then one of the things that happens is it still will be stuck in there. You'll find it won't want to come out too easily. So a trick that I ended up doing was placing a little screwdriver, kind of starting to wedge it in between the chip and the board. Of course, you don't want to pry. You'll end up cracking the board itself. But you just want to have just a little bit of pressure and just start pushing down with it on this finger. And then what you're going to end up doing is taking your soldering iron and then running it across all the little legs here to start heating up that solder. And then while you're giving a little bit of force on the screwdriver, and then you'll find that it'll actually start peeling away slowly. And again, you kind of want to work on either side here, kind of work on both sides, start getting that solder heated up and loosened up. This one's actually getting a little bit more trouble than the other one I worked on. The other one actually started to come out a fair bit easier. There we go. It's starting to go now. There we go. There. Set that aside. So again, I didn't even apply too much pressure, just enough that as that solder was starting to heat up, it was pulling it away, because with the solder sucker and probably even the braided method, you're never going to get every last drop that's connecting the chip to the board. And again, you don't want to try to forcefully break it apart. You want to be able to work it out as the solder becomes heated up. So I'm going to go ahead and clean up this board a little bit. There's little solder blobs that are all over the place. I'm going to go ahead and clean this up with some alcohol and get it prepped for the new solder that we're going to be doing. Okay, and I guess I figured I would maybe just show you all I'm doing. And again, everything that I'm doing here is pretty low tech. I'm not like a professional at repairing electronics equipment, but all I'm doing is using isopropyl alcohol and just taking some old cloth from a t-shirt I ended up cutting, just getting that wet, and just taking that wet portion and just rubbing it over the board here, right where we actually started desoldering, because you'll find with the solder sucker you get little bits that still kind of spurt out all over the board, and we don't want any rogue solder just lying around on this board. We want to make sure it's all cleaned up. And even here, just with a nice little scrub, it might be hard to pick up on camera, but to my eyes I see it's very clean. No solder is dripped between the two different points. There it is, there we go. There's like a little ball of it right there. I just took my fingernail and scraped it off. But yeah, this is clean and ready to go to put in the new chip. And here's our new chip. And here's my two old ones. And then the chip that you're going to line up here, when you're looking at the board like this, it even shows you the number IC20 or 4021 from the factory. You're actually going to want to go ahead and load it up with the letters facing up on your new chip as well. And then also I noticed too that the legs themselves are spread out on these new ones just a little bit wider than what the board has. So you're going to want to kind of squeeze those in ever so gently without bending them too far, just to get them to where they actually line up into the holes. And then what I found was pretty easy to do is, going back to my little screwdriver here, first I lined up the bottom row, and then I slowly start pushing in each individual leg into their respective holes on the top. There we go, until it just pops into place. And we want to make sure it's seated down all the way. Then we're going to go ahead and run some solder into the new legs for this new chip here. And again, I am no professional at this, and I'm pretty sure there's a lot of other people out there that solder on a regular basis that would probably give you better pointers. And again, if you don't feel comfortable with soldering your own board, I'd recommend you probably finding somebody who knows what they're doing, rather than taking a chance of burning up something. So what we're going to go ahead and do is go ahead and pre-solder the tip here. And then what I found was the easiest for me, if I could get it in the frame as best as possible, was after I have a little blob of solder on my tip ready to go, I go ahead and kind of brush that onto the leg. And then what I notice is it seems to fill up the void on its own with very little effort. It's almost as if I'm with that little blob of it there on the gun. As I scrape it off of the leg, it just wants to naturally flow down into the little divot covering the leg. And then that's what we're going to want to repeat over and over, just going across each leg, get a little bit more solder, because before, when I tried to solder it directly here, what I was noticing is too much solder was flowing into the little void here where the legs or the little pins come through, and then I was afraid that it was going to overflow and then touch the next leg, and that's something we want to try to avoid. Okay, my soldering portion is finished. Not the most pretty looking or anything like that, but kind of the trick you want to do is as you put on the little blobs of solder, you want to also have it each part here, or each solder point, as the solder gets onto the little legs here, you almost kind of want them to look like little Hershey's Kisses, where they're wider at the base and then they kind of follow up. That seems to be the way they look from the factory when they were made. And then it also makes it look a little bit cleaner. And at this point, now that the soldering is done, this is where you would want to go through with like a multimeter. Since we're just doing a continuity test, even a very cheap multimeter would do the trick, where you just get a little beep when you hear, or when it senses continuity. So what we'd actually do here then is we would go through and touch each neighboring leg to make sure that our solder points are not touching. So I'm going to go through and touch each leg, just moving one down on either side, and just keep going down. So if you were to hear continuity between there, then that means you need to look and make sure there's no solder that's seeped in between each point. Because again, we don't want them to connect. We don't want them to be any continuity between these legs as far as their neighboring, with each leg's neighbor. This one looks clean. I don't have any beeping noises between the two, so I'm going to go ahead and clean up the board again with some alcohol and button up the controller, and then try it out. Okay, got the controller put together now, and I'm going to go ahead and test it out. So let's get that plugged in. Yep, there we go. Already right away we're getting at least the start button to work. Yep, we got A, got B, all the directional movements, and feels pretty good. Alright, well there you go. So if you have a broken NES controller, and again you know that your console is working just fine, and you know the cable itself is okay, the majority of the controllers that are not working, the problem is the IC chip, and that's what you're going to need to replace. And so far I'm 2 for 2 on my controllers. Got them working, and I'm very happy to see everything's working again.